of
down,
curiosity,
we give a
cooperation, and
thumbs
connection. Because the true power of this story does not come only from discovering how to stop a cosmic disaster. It comes from examining why someone would continue fighting when the odds are almost impossible, and why the solution to humanity's greatest crisis may come from understanding something completely different from ourselves. The journey begins by examining the architecture of the narrative itself, how the mystery of Ryland Grace's lost memories creates tension, how the film's scientific challenges become sources of emotional conflict, and how every discovery pushes the story beyond a simple survival adventure. The structure of the story is carefully designed around questions that are both scientific and deeply philosophical. What happens when knowledge is the only weapon available? How does a person define responsibility when they never asked for it? And what does it truly mean to save humanity? From there, the analysis will explore the scientific imagination behind the story. Project Hail Mary is built on the foundation of hard science fiction, where ideas about physics, biology, astronomy, and engineering are not just background details but essential parts of the emotional experience. The scientific problems are not obstacles placed in front of the characters. They are the language through which the characters communicate with the universe itself. But the most fascinating part of this journey is not the technology or the mission. It is the relationship that challenges everything audiences expect from alien encounters. At the center of the story is the unexpected connection between Ryland Grace and Rocky, a relationship that completely reshapes the traditional first contact narrative. For decades, science fiction has often portrayed alien life through fear, conflict, or uncertainty. The unknown is usually something humanity must defend itself against. Project Hail Mary explores a different possibility. What if the greatest discovery in human history was not finding alien life, but realizing that intelligence does not have to look, sound, or think like us to become a source of friendship? What begins as a meeting between two completely different forms of life develops into something that challenges assumptions about communication, trust, and cooperation. This idea feels especially meaningful in a modern science fiction landscape often dominated by darker visions of the future. Many contemporary stories focus on collapse, isolation, artificial intelligence fears, or humanity's inability to overcome its own flaws. Project Hail Mary takes a different path by asking whether optimism itself can be a powerful survival tool. The story does not ignore humanity's weaknesses, but it suggests that curiosity and empathy may be among our greatest strengths. The universe may be vast, dangerous, and indifferent, but connection can still exist across impossible distances. Through narrative analysis, scientific exploration, character psychology, and visual storytelling, this essay will uncover why Project Hail Mary represents more than another space adventure. It is a story about survival, but even more importantly, it is a story about why survival matters in the first place. For generations, humanity has looked toward the stars with a strange mixture of wonder and fear. The night sky has always represented possibility. As children, many of us looked upward and imagined distant planets, unknown civilizations, and adventures waiting beyond Earth. Space was not just an empty void. It was a place where anything seemed possible. That childhood fascination is at the heart of great science fiction. It captures the excitement of discovery, the feeling that the universe is far bigger than anything we can understand. But alongside that sense of wonder exists another emotion that is equally powerful, the fear of being completely alone. Because space is not only vast, it is silent. The idea of drifting through an endless universe with no one nearby, no familiar voices, and no guarantee that anyone will ever find you touches one of humanity's deepest fears. Stories about isolation in space have always connected with audiences because they take a simple human experience, the need for connection, and place it against the largest possible backdrop. Project Hail Mary takes that fear and pushes it to its extreme. Ryland Grace is not a fearless explorer who has spent his entire life preparing for the unknown. He is not someone who has always dreamed of leaving Earth behind. He is a person who represents something much more familiar, an ordinary individual suddenly confronted with an extraordinary situation. That is what makes his journey so compelling. At his core, Grace is someone many viewers can recognize. He is a teacher, a problem solver, and someone who understands the world through curiosity rather than ambition. His greatest strength is not physical power or heroic confidence. It is his ability to keep asking questions when the answers seem impossible. That relatability creates an emotional connection. The story is not asking audiences to imagine themselves as perfect astronauts or legendary scientists. It asks a much more personal question. What would you do if the responsibility of saving everyone fell onto your shoulders? Most people will never command a spacecraft or travel beyond Earth's atmosphere. But everyone understands the feeling of being overwhelmed by a challenge they never expected. Everyone knows what it means to face uncertainty, to search for solutions without knowing whether they will work, and to continue moving forward despite fear. This is where Project Hail Mary separates itself from many traditional science fiction stories. The adventure is enormous, but the emotional foundation remains deeply human. The story connects with the same curiosity that has driven generations of dreamers to study the stars. It reminds audiences why we search for life beyond Earth in the first place, not simply to prove we are not alone, but to understand what connection might look like when it exists beyond our own species.
For viewers who love intelligent science fiction, this journey offers something increasingly rare, a story that embraces complexity without losing heart. It combines scientific mystery with emotional discovery, proving that the greatest questions in the universe are not always about distant galaxies or impossible technology. Sometimes, the most fascinating discovery is what happens when two completely different beings choose to trust each other. And that possibility is exactly why Project Hail Mary has captured the imagination of modern science fiction audiences. It is not only a story about reaching the stars. It is a reminder of the human instinct that sends us there in the first place, the desire to explore, to understand, and to find someone else in the darkness. The journey of Project Hail Mary from a scientific thought experiment into a major cinematic experience begins with a writer whose storytelling philosophy has always been built on one simple idea: curiosity comes first. Andy Weir did not approach science fiction by starting with futuristic technology or impossible inventions. Instead, he began with questions. What would actually happen if a person faced this situation? What limitations would physics create? What solutions could a human realistically discover with the knowledge available? That approach became the foundation of his breakout success, The Martian. The novel became famous because it treated science not as decoration, but as the engine driving the story forward. Every problem had a logical foundation, and every solution came from creativity, experimentation, and a deep understanding of how the physical world operates. With Project Hail Mary, Weir expanded that philosophy beyond the boundaries of Mars and into the much larger question of humanity's place in the universe. Instead of focusing on one astronaut trying to survive alone on another planet, the story explored an extinction-level mystery involving Earth, the Sun, and a threat unlike anything humanity had encountered before. The challenge was no longer simply survival. It was understanding the unknown. Weir's writing process has always involved extensive research, calculations, and scientific exploration. His stories are built around the idea that even the most extraordinary circumstances can feel believable when they are grounded in real scientific principles. That commitment created a unique challenge for adapting Project Hail Mary. The film needed to preserve the intellectual excitement of the novel while translating complex scientific concepts into a visual language that audiences could immediately understand. Bringing that vision to the screen required a creative team capable of balancing scientific accuracy with emotional storytelling. Directors Phil Lord and Christopher Miller brought their distinctive ability to combine large-scale concepts with human-centered humor and character-driven moments. Their previous work demonstrated an understanding that even the most imaginative worlds succeed when audiences can connect emotionally with the people inside them. The screenplay adaptation by Drew Goddard became another crucial part of that transformation. Adapting a novel like Project Hail Mary is not simply a matter of transferring events from page to screen. The written story can spend pages exploring scientific ideas, internal thoughts, and detailed explanations. Film, however, must communicate through performance, visuals, pacing, and emotion. Goddard's challenge was finding the balance between maintaining the scientific complexity that defines the story while creating a cinematic rhythm that keeps audiences invested. The science needed to remain important, but it could never overpower the human journey at the center. Perhaps the greatest challenge came from the story's unusual protagonist and environment. Much of the narrative depends on Ryland Grace existing in isolation, surrounded by technology and scientific problems rather than traditional action sequences or large groups of characters. For an actor, this creates a demanding performance challenge. Instead of relying on constant interaction, the emotional weight must come from internal conflict, reactions, and the ability to make solitude feel engaging. Ryan Gosling's casting placed that responsibility at the center of the film. The role required an actor capable of carrying long stretches of the story through intelligence, vulnerability, and emotional subtlety. Grace is not a typical action hero. His strength comes from his mind, his adaptability, and his ability to remain human under impossible pressure. Creating a believable experience also required solving one of science fiction's oldest cinematic problems: how to make space travel feel physically real. Unlike many fictional depictions where spacecraft move like airplanes and ignore the limitations of the universe, Project Hail Mary is built around the realities of Newtonian physics and relativistic travel. In space, there are no simple shortcuts. Acceleration, momentum, distance, and time all shape the journey. A spacecraft cannot simply turn around, stop instantly, or move without consequences. Every movement must respect the laws of physics, and those limitations become part of the storytelling itself. The filmmakers faced the challenge of visualizing these concepts without overwhelming the audience. The goal was not to turn the movie into a science lecture, but to make viewers feel the scale and danger of traveling through an environment where even small mistakes can become catastrophic. This balance between realism and entertainment is what defines Project Hail Mary's creative ambition. The film does not use science as a background element. Science is the language of the story, the source of conflict, and the pathway toward discovery. From Andy Weir's research-driven imagination to the collaborative efforts of the filmmakers bringing that imagination to life, the production represents a rare attempt to make intellectual curiosity feel cinematic. The challenge was enormous: take a story built around equations, physics, and an unfamiliar form of life, then transform it into an emotional experience shared by audiences around the world. The result is a production journey centered on one fascinating question: how do you make the impossible feel not only believable, but deeply human? Before Project Hail Mary reached audiences, it entered a science fiction landscape shaped by both enormous expectations and changing tastes. For years, the genre had often been associated with darker visions of the future: collapsing civilizations, artificial intelligence fears, alien threats, and stories focused on humanity's struggle against its own weaknesses. Many modern science fiction films explored what could go wrong when technology advances faster than our ability to control it. But alongside those darker narratives, another movement was gaining momentum. Audiences were beginning to reconnect with a different kind of science fiction: stories built around curiosity, discovery, and the belief that intelligence and cooperation could still solve impossible problems. This shift created the perfect environment for a story like Project Hail Mary. The film arrived carrying the legacy of previous hard science fiction successes, particularly stories that proved audiences were willing to embrace scientific complexity when it was connected to strong emotional stakes. Films such as Interstellar demonstrated that concepts like relativity, space exploration, and cosmic mysteries could become mainstream cinematic experiences without abandoning human emotion. Meanwhile, The Martian showed that problem-solving itself could become thrilling when a story trusted audiences to enjoy the process of discovery. Project Hail Mary entered this conversation as the next major test of that approach. The expectations were naturally high because the source material came from Andy Weir, whose reputation had been built around transforming scientific accuracy into accessible storytelling. Readers of the novel already knew the appeal of the story, a combination of technical challenges, unexpected discoveries, humor, and emotional connection. But adapting that formula for the big screen presented significant risks. A novel can spend time inside a character's thoughts. It can explain calculations, scientific theories, and complex solutions through detailed descriptions. A film does not have that same luxury. It must communicate visually and emotionally, keeping viewers engaged even when the central conflicts involve physics, chemistry, and biology rather than traditional action. The marketing strategy reflected this challenge. The promotional campaign needed to attract a wide audience while protecting one of the story's most important elements, the mystery surrounding Rocky. The existence of an alien companion represented a major emotional and thematic turning point, but revealing too much could weaken the impact of the discovery. Instead, the marketing emphasized the elements audiences could immediately understand: a lone astronaut, a desperate mission, and the survival of humanity itself. Ryan Gosling's presence became a major part of the film's appeal, helping introduce the story to viewers who may not normally seek out hard science fiction. This created an interesting balance. On one side was the promise of a thrilling space survival story. On the other was the hidden complexity of a narrative that would eventually challenge traditional ideas about alien encounters and human cooperation. The decision to keep certain aspects of the story mysterious showed confidence in the emotional power of discovery. Rather than selling every major idea immediately, the campaign allowed curiosity to become part of the audience experience. However, the production also faced a significant industry challenge, convincing studios that a high-budget science fiction film centered heavily around one performer could succeed. Unlike many modern blockbusters built around large ensembles, constant action, or recognizable franchises, Project Hail Mary depends heavily on isolation, scientific investigation, and gradual emotional development. That structure required trust. The film needed audiences to invest in a character spending long periods alone, solving problems through thought rather than physical confrontation. It needed viewers to become fascinated by questions instead of explosions, by discovery instead of destruction. This represented both the film's greatest risk and its greatest opportunity. In an era where many large-scale science fiction projects focused on spectacle, Project Hail Mary offered something different: the idea that intelligence itself could be cinematic. A person thinking, experimenting, failing, and trying again could create the same level of tension as any traditional action sequence. The anticipation surrounding the adaptation came from this unusual combination. It carried the reputation of a best-selling science fiction novel, the appeal of a major Hollywood star, and the ambition of a story determined to make scientific optimism feel exciting again. The question surrounding its release was not simply whether audiences would accept another journey into space. It was whether they were ready for a different vision of the future, one where humanity's greatest advantage was not strength, technology, or power, but the ability to learn, adapt, and connect with something beyond itself. Ryland Grace's story begins with one of the most unsettling experiences imaginable: waking up inside a spacecraft with no memory of who he is, where he is, or why he is there. There is no heroic introduction. No moment of confidence. No explanation waiting to guide him through the impossible situation. Instead, the first moments of consciousness are filled with confusion, fear, and instinct. His body awakens before his mind does. He must rediscover even the simplest actions, moving his arms, understanding his surroundings, and remembering how to exist as a person. The environment around him provides only fragments of information. The unfamiliar machinery, the weight of his own body, and the strange silence surrounding him suggest that he is somewhere far beyond ordinary human experience. But the greatest mystery is not the spacecraft itself. It is himself. The loss of memory transforms Ryland Grace into both the protagonist and the mystery he must solve. Before he can understand the mission, he must reconstruct his own identity. Every discovery becomes a small victory against the emptiness inside his mind. This approach creates a unique kind of tension. Normally, science fiction heroes begin their journeys with knowledge and preparation. They understand the mission, the technology, and the dangers ahead. Grace begins with none of that. He is forced to investigate his own existence using the same method a scientist would use to study an unknown phenomenon. Observation. Experimentation. Deduction. Even before he remembers his purpose, his scientific instincts return. He begins testing the environment around him, searching for clues that can reveal the reality of his situation. One of his earliest discoveries comes through understanding gravity. By carefully observing physical reactions and conducting simple experiments, he begins determining where he is and what kind of environment surrounds him. These moments reveal one of the most important aspects of Grace's character. His greatest tool is not strength or bravery in the traditional sense. It is his ability to remain curious under pressure. Where another person might panic, Grace investigates. Where another person might surrender to fear, he searches for answers. The pendulum experiment becomes a perfect example of this mindset. With limited resources and incomplete information, he uses basic scientific principles to understand the spacecraft's artificial gravity and location. It is a small experiment, but emotionally it represents something much larger, a man rebuilding his connection to reality one fact at a time. The story uses these early scientific discoveries to create a feeling of isolation without making isolation empty. The spacecraft is not just a setting. It becomes a puzzle box. Every object, every measurement, and every observation has the potential to reveal another piece of the truth. But while Grace is trying to understand his present, the audience begins to uncover pieces of the past. Through flashbacks, the story slowly reveals how humanity arrived at this desperate point. Before the Hail Mary mission existed, Earth was facing a threat unlike anything previously encountered. Scientists discovered that the sun was losing energy, creating a phenomenon that could eventually push the planet into a devastating global ice age. The cause was something completely unexpected: astrophage. A microscopic organism unlike anything humanity had ever discovered. The discovery challenged everything scientists believed about life and the universe. Astrophage was not a simple threat that could be eliminated through conventional methods. It was an unknown biological phenomenon affecting the most important source of energy for human civilization. The growing mystery surrounding the sun led to the discovery of the Petrova line, a strange pattern of activity stretching through space. It represented both a warning and a clue. Something was happening beyond Earth, and understanding it became humanity's greatest scientific priority. This is where Eva Stratt enters the story. Tasked with coordinating the global response, Stratt represents a completely different kind of leadership from Grace. Where he approaches problems through curiosity and experimentation, she approaches them through urgency and decision-making. The survival of humanity requires someone willing to make impossible choices without hesitation. Her search for solutions eventually leads her to people with the knowledge needed to fight the crisis, including Ryland Grace. But at this stage of the story, Grace does not remember any of that. The man drifting through space does not know why billions of lives depend on him. He does not know the sacrifices made to send him there. He does not know that his forgotten past contains the answers to a mission that may determine the future of Earth. All he knows is that he has awakened in the darkness with a problem to solve. And slowly, through science, memory, and determination, he begins uncovering the reason he was sent across the universe. As Ryland Grace continues searching through the fragments of his forgotten past, the mystery surrounding the Hail Mary mission begins to take a darker shape. The memories returning to him are not simply personal recollections. They are pieces of a global emergency, a desperate effort that pushed humanity beyond normal limits and forced leaders to make decisions that would have been unimaginable under ordinary circumstances. At the center of this response was Eva Stratt. Stratt's role in saving humanity was unlike any traditional position of authority. She was not simply a scientist leading a research team or a politician negotiating international cooperation. She was given extraordinary control over the resources of the entire planet. Governments, organizations, and institutions that normally operated independently were forced to work under one unified mission: survival. This level of authority reveals the scale of the crisis. The threat facing Earth was not something that could be solved through slow debates or competing interests. The timeline was too short, and the consequences were too severe. Humanity was facing a problem measured not in decades or centuries, but in the immediate future. Stratt understood that saving the world required removing every obstacle standing in the way of progress. Scientific projects could not wait for approval. Resources could not be delayed by bureaucracy. Decisions that would normally require years of discussion had to be made instantly. Her approach was ruthless, but the story presents an important question through her actions. When extinction is the alternative, how much control should one person be allowed to have? Stratt's leadership creates a fascinating contrast with Ryland Grace. She represents urgency, sacrifice, and difficult choices. Grace represents curiosity, patience, and the belief that understanding a problem is the first step towards solving it. Both approaches become necessary. The creation of the Hail Mary mission represents humanity's final attempt to answer the mystery behind the astrophage crisis. But as Grace slowly remembers the details, he discovers the most devastating truth about the mission. The Hail Mary was never designed as a journey home. It was a one-way trip. The realization changes the emotional meaning of everything. Space exploration has traditionally carried the promise of discovery and return. Astronauts leave Earth knowing there is a possibility of coming back, of sharing what they learned with the people waiting for them. The Hail Mary mission offers no such comfort. Its crew is sent into the unknown knowing that their sacrifice may be permanent. They are not explorers returning with stories. They are humanity's final gamble, carrying the hope that future generations might exist because they chose to leave everything behind. For Grace, this truth creates a painful conflict. His past self was not someone eager to become a martyr. He was not searching for glory or dreaming of becoming a legendary hero. He was a person who valued his ordinary life, his teaching, and his ability to influence students through science. The idea of willingly entering a mission with almost no chance of survival goes against everything natural about human instinct. And yet circumstances eventually make the choice unavoidable. The mission requires knowledge that only certain individuals possess. Every expert, every discovery, and every possible solution becomes part of humanity's final effort. Grace's involvement is not driven by a desire for adventure. It comes from necessity, from the realization that sometimes the world places responsibilities on people who never asked for them. This makes his journey different from the classic hero's adventure. Grace does not chase destiny. Destiny finds him. As the present-day mission continues, Grace finally reaches the destination that humanity hoped would provide answers, Tau Ceti. The star system represents both hope and uncertainty. After traveling across unimaginable distances, after leaving behind everything familiar, Grace arrives at the place where the mystery surrounding astrophage might finally be solved. But instead of finding immediate answers, he encounters something that changes the entire nature of the mission. Another spacecraft. At first, the discovery is impossible to process. In the vast emptiness of space, where humanity believed it was searching alone, there is evidence of another intelligent presence. The detection of an unidentified alien vessel, later known as the Blip 2, creates a moment of profound realization. Grace is no longer the only traveler in the darkness. The signal transforms the mission from a solitary scientific investigation into something far more extraordinary. Humanity's greatest crisis may not be an isolated event. The solution may not exist only within human knowledge. Somewhere in the universe, another intelligence has been searching for answers too. And for the first time since waking up with no memory, Ryland Grace discovers that he may not be alone. The universe that once felt silent suddenly becomes alive with possibility, introducing a mystery far greater than the one he originally set out to solve. The discovery of another spacecraft near Tau Ceti changes everything Ryland Grace thought he understood about the mission. For so long, the Hail Mary represented humanity's desperate search for answers in an empty universe. It was a journey built on the assumption that Earth was facing this crisis alone. But the universe was not silent. Another intelligence had reached the same destination. The first contact between Grace and the unknown spacecraft is not a moment of instant understanding or dramatic communication. It is a scene defined by caution, uncertainty, and the overwhelming realization that two completely different forms of life are attempting to bridge an impossible divide. The alien vessel, the Blip 2, belongs to a species unlike anything humanity has ever encountered. There is no familiar humanoid shape, no human-like expression, and no easy way to interpret its behavior. The encounter challenges one of science fiction's oldest assumptions, that intelligent life will communicate in ways humans can naturally recognize. Instead, Grace discovers something far more fascinating. Intelligence does not need to resemble humanity. The being he encounters is Rocky, an Iridian engineer whose appearance immediately challenges human expectations. Rocky is not designed to make audiences comfortable through familiarity. He represents something truly alien, a life form shaped by a completely different environment, biology, and evolutionary history. Yet beneath those differences exists something recognizable: curiosity, problem solving, the desire to survive. The first physical connection between the two spacecraft requires creativity and trust. The two vessels were not designed to interact with each other, and neither species can simply step into the other's environment. Their worlds operate under different conditions, with different atmospheric requirements and biological needs. Creating a connection between the ships becomes a scientific problem before it becomes a social one. A sealed passageway must be constructed, allowing the two explorers to interact without exposing either of them to an environment that could be deadly. The solution represents the first true act of cooperation between humanity and the Iridians. Before they can share knowledge, they must first create a space where communication is possible. This moment is important because it reflects the central philosophy of Project Hail Mary. First contact is not portrayed as a dramatic confrontation between two civilizations. There is no immediate conflict, fear, or competition. The first step is engineering. The second is understanding. The language barrier becomes the next major challenge. Humans have spent centuries developing methods of communication based on spoken language, written symbols, and visual expression. Rocky's communication system is completely different. Instead of words, he uses musical tones, frequencies, and complex sound patterns. To Grace, these sounds initially appear impossible to interpret. They are not arranged according to human language structures. They are closer to a combination of mathematics, music, and physical signals. But this is exactly the kind of problem Grace is built to solve. Rather than assuming communication is impossible, he approaches it scientifically. He studies patterns, analyzes frequencies, and searches for repetition and meaning. Through sound analysis and careful observation, the two begin creating a shared foundation of understanding. The process is slow, imperfect, and filled with uncertainty. But every successful exchange represents something extraordinary. Two species separated by millions of miles are teaching each other how to think. This relationship becomes even more meaningful when Grace discovers that Rocky is not simply investigating the astrophage phenomenon out of curiosity. The Iridian civilization faces the same existential threat as humanity. Their planet, arid, is also struggling against the devastating effects of astrophage. The crisis that brought Grace into space is not unique to Earth. It is affecting another world. This revelation changes the purpose of the mission completely. The Hail Mary was originally humanity's attempt to save itself, but Grace now realizes that survival is not limited to one planet. Two completely different civilizations are facing the same enemy, and both possess knowledge the other lacks. Human science and Iridian engineering become complementary forces. Grace brings the analytical methods, biological understanding, and scientific perspective of humanity. Rocky contributes the advanced engineering abilities of his species and a completely different approach to solving problems. Together, they represent something neither civilization could achieve alone. The partnership also changes the emotional nature of the story. The alien encounter is not about proving whether humans are superior or whether extraterrestrial life should be feared. It becomes a reminder that intelligence itself is a universal language. The two beings do not become allies because they are similar. They become allies because they are willing to understand their differences. Their shared investigation leads them back to the source of the astrophage crisis. Both civilizations need the same answer. If this organism is causing such devastating damage, is there something in the universe capable of controlling it? A predator. A weakness. A natural solution hidden somewhere within the cosmic ecosystem. Together, Grace and Rocky begin examining the environment around Tau Ceti, searching for clues that could reveal astrophage's place in the chain of life. Their mission evolves from survival into discovery, from two separate struggles into a shared scientific pursuit. And with every experiment they conduct together, the impossible becomes slightly less impossible. Humanity is no longer facing the darkness alone. For the first time, two worlds are working toward the same goal. The partnership between Ryland Grace and Rocky transforms the mission from a desperate search into a collaborative scientific investigation. For the first time, humanity and the Iridians are no longer simply reacting to the astrophage crisis. They are actively searching for a weakness in the organism that threatens both of their worlds. Their answer comes from looking beyond the obvious. Astrophage is powerful because of its ability to absorb energy and survive in extreme environments. But every living organism, no matter how advanced or unusual, exists within some kind of natural system. If astrophage can consume energy on a massive scale, perhaps something else in the universe has evolved to consume astrophage itself. The discovery begins with atmospheric samples from Tau Ceti. Grace and Rocky examine the surrounding environment, searching for biological clues that could explain why this region of space behaves differently from areas affected by the astrophage crisis. Slowly, they uncover something unexpected. A microscopic organism capable of feeding on astrophage. They name it Amoeba. The discovery represents the breakthrough both civilizations have been searching for. For months, the mission has been defined by uncertainty and impossible problems. Now, they finally have evidence that the astrophage threat may have a natural solution. But finding a possible answer is only the beginning. The real challenge is turning that discovery into something usable. Amoeba must be studied, reproduced, and transported safely. It needs to survive under controlled conditions and maintain the ability to consume astrophage without creating new dangers. The solution to the greatest crisis in human history is not a weapon or a machine. It is a living organism. And living organisms do not always behave according to expectations. The experiments become increasingly complex as Grace and Rocky attempt to understand Amoeba's biology. Every test carries enormous consequences. A successful result could save billions of lives, but a mistake could destroy their only chance of returning with an answer. This tension highlights one of the story's most important themes. Scientific progress is never a straight path from discovery to victory. Every breakthrough creates new questions. Every solution introduces new risks. The moment of hope quickly turns into disaster when their experiments produce an unexpected problem. The amoeba they create begins changing. Instead of remaining contained and predictable, it adapts. The organism's ability to consume astrophage becomes more dangerous than they anticipated. The very quality that makes it valuable, the ability to break down astrophage, creates a terrifying possibility. What if it can break down something else? The answer arrives when they discover that the mutated amoeba can consume xenonite, the extremely durable material protecting their spacecraft and equipment. The situation immediately changes from scientific breakthrough to survival crisis. the material they depend on for protection is no longer reliable. A microscopic organism has become capable of threatening the very structures keeping them alive. The danger is no longer outside the spacecraft. It is inside. The accident creates chaos across both vessels. Containment systems fail, emergency procedures are activated, and the careful balance that allowed two different species to work together begins collapsing. For Grace and Rocky, the crisis becomes a test of everything they have built. Their partnership was formed through patience, communication, and shared discovery. Now, it must survive fear, urgency, and physical danger. There is no time for perfect solutions. They must make decisions with incomplete information, trusting each other despite the possibility that one mistake could end everything. The emergency becomes especially devastating for Rocky. The Iridian engineer, who had become the emotional and scientific center of the mission, suffers severe injuries during the rescue effort. The physical consequences of the disaster reveal another important reality of their partnership: cooperation does not erase vulnerability. Even with advanced technology and incredible intelligence, both beings remain fragile. The rescue operation pushes the limits of the spacecraft and the people inside it. Extreme acceleration places enormous physical stress on their bodies as they attempt to prevent further damage and stabilize the situation. For Grace, the crisis becomes more than another scientific problem. It becomes personal. Earlier, the mission was about saving Earth. Then it became about saving two worlds. But now, it becomes about saving the one person who made the impossible mission feel possible. Rocky is no longer simply an alien scientist helping humanity. He is a friend. That emotional shift changes the meaning of the mission. The story is no longer driven only by responsibility or survival. It is driven by connection. Grace is willing to risk himself because the person beside him matters. The Tamiba discovery proves that the universe may contain answers hidden in unexpected places. But the catastrophe that follows reveals an equally important truth: knowledge alone is not enough. Science can provide solutions, but it is trust, cooperation, and sacrifice that allow those solutions to survive. With their greatest discovery now carrying an unimaginable danger, Grace and Rocky face their most difficult challenge yet. They have found the key to defeating astrophage, but they must first prove they can control the very thing that might destroy them. After everything Ryland, Grace, and Rocky have endured, the impossible finally begins to feel achievable. The mission that started as humanity's desperate final gamble has produced the one thing both civilizations needed: a way to fight back against astrophage. Through countless experiments, failures, and moments where survival seemed uncertain, they finally create a stable form of Tamiba. The organism that once represented a dangerous unknown has become the key to restoring balance across two worlds. For the first time since leaving Earth, Grace can see a path home. The solution is carefully prepared and sent forward. Probes carrying the discovery begin their journey toward Earth, carrying the hope that humanity can survive the crisis that forced the Hail Mary mission into existence. The information inside those probes represents years of sacrifice, scientific effort, and the combined knowledge of two intelligent species that never expected to meet. The mission has succeeded. At least, that is what it appears to be. But success comes with an unexpected emotional cost. After spending so much time together, Grace and Rocky must separate. Their partnership, which began with uncertainty and confusion, has become one of the most meaningful connections either species has ever experienced. They entered the mission as two strangers from completely different worlds. They leave as friends. The farewell between them carries a unique sadness because both understand what the separation means. They are returning to their own planets, their own civilizations, and their own responsibilities. The journey that brought them together was extraordinary, but it cannot continue forever. Grace begins his return toward Earth. Rocky begins his journey back toward Arid. For the first time in a long while, they are once again alone. But the mission's final challenge arrives when Grace notices something that does not make sense. The numbers, the calculations, and the scientific evidence reveal a terrifying possibility. The Tamiba solution that works for humanity may not work for the Iridians. Rocky's journey home depends on the same technology that protects his spacecraft. His fuel tanks are designed with xenonite, a material considered nearly impossible to damage. But Tamiba has changed. The organism that allowed them to defeat Astrophage has also gained the ability to consume xenonite. And if it continues spreading, Rocky's spacecraft will eventually fail. The discovery forces Grace to confront the most painful choice of his entire journey. He can continue toward Earth. He can return home, reunite with humanity, and finally receive the life he sacrificed everything to protect. Or he can turn around. He can abandon his chance to return and save the one person who made the mission possible. This moment reveals the true transformation of Ryland Grace. At the beginning of the story, he was someone who never wanted to become a hero. He did not seek recognition, adventure, or sacrifice. He was simply a teacher pulled into a situation far beyond anything he imagined. But throughout his journey, his understanding of responsibility changes. Saving humanity is no longer just about protecting his own species. The universe is larger than that. Rocky is not an alien obstacle, a scientific curiosity, or a temporary partner. He is a friend. And Grace realizes that if he chooses his own survival over Rocky's, then he is abandoning the very principle that made their mission successful in the first place. Cooperation. Understanding. Trust. In the end, the greatest solution discovered during the mission is not Tamiba. It is empathy. Grace turns the Hail Mary around. It is a decision that changes his entire future. Instead of returning to Earth, he chooses a path that leads him toward Arid, knowing that his own civilization may continue without him. He accepts exile from everything familiar because another world, and one extraordinary friend, needs him more. The choice is not presented as a traditional heroic victory. There is no celebration, no audience witnessing the sacrifice, no guarantee that Grace will ever see home again. It is simply the decision of one person choosing another life over his own comfort. Years later, that decision becomes something far more meaningful than a sacrifice. On Arid, Grace builds a new existence. The man who once taught science to children on Earth becomes a teacher on another planet, sharing knowledge with a completely different civilization. He does not return home as a legendary astronaut. He becomes something much more fitting. A bridge between worlds. Eventually, confirmation arrives that Earth survived. The probes reached their destination, and humanity received the solution needed to overcome the astrophage crisis. Grace's mission succeeded, even though he was never there to witness the outcome firsthand. The final irony of his journey is that the man who saved Earth never returned to Earth. But he found something beyond survival. He found belonging in a place he never expected, among beings he never imagined meeting. What began as a lonely mission through the darkness of space became a story about the unexpected connections that make the universe feel less empty. Ryland Grace did not become a hero because he saved humanity. He became a hero because, when given the choice, he understood that humanity was never the only thing worth saving. At the center of Project Hail Mary is a protagonist who challenges one of the most common ideas about heroism. Ryland Grace does not begin his journey as a fearless explorer, a confident leader, or someone searching for a grand purpose. In many ways, he begins as the opposite of the traditional science fiction hero. He is afraid. He doubts himself. He does not want the responsibility placed on his shoulders. And that is exactly what makes his transformation so powerful. The external mission appears simple at first: save Earth from the extinction threat caused by astrophage. The entire planet's survival depends on finding a solution, and Grace becomes the person standing between humanity and disaster. But beneath that external mission is a much more personal struggle. Grace's real challenge is not only defeating an alien organism or solving an impossible scientific problem. His deeper conflict is confronting the parts of himself that he wants to avoid. He must overcome fear, guilt, and the belief that he is not the kind of person capable of making the ultimate sacrifice. The story does not present heroism as something a person is born with. It presents heroism as something a person chooses. Before becoming humanity's last hope, Grace was simply a teacher. He was someone who found meaning in explaining complicated ideas and helping others understand the world around them. His life was built around knowledge, communication, and curiosity rather than adventure or danger. That background becomes one of his greatest strengths. In a typical survival story, intelligence is often shown as the ability to solve technical problems. But Grace's intelligence goes beyond equations and experiments. His greatest ability is making sense of complexity. He can take something confusing and break it down into understandable pieces. That skill becomes essential in space. The Hail Mary mission constantly places him in situations where there are no instructions, no experts nearby, and no guaranteed solutions. He survives because he approaches every challenge like a teacher and scientist. He observes, experiments, explains, and adapts. Even when speaking to Rocky, his teaching instincts become the foundation of their relationship. Communication between two completely different species seems impossible, but Grace does not approach the problem with frustration or superiority. He approaches it with patience. He teaches. He listens. He learns. This reveals something important about his character. Grace's greatest talent was never simply knowing information. It was understanding how knowledge could be shared. However, the memories he recovers about the mission reveal a much more complicated version of himself. Before the Hail Mary launched, Grace was not a willing volunteer stepping forward with confidence. He was pushed into the mission through circumstances beyond his control. Eva Stratt's involvement exposes one of the darkest truths behind his journey. Grace was not chosen because he wanted to become a hero. He was chosen because his knowledge was necessary, and the mission required someone with his specific expertise. The reality is uncomfortable. The man humanity depended on was not someone who eagerly accepted the burden. He was someone who had to be forced into carrying it. This makes his eventual transformation far more meaningful. If Grace had always been courageous, his journey would have been predictable. Instead, the story asks a more interesting question. Can someone who does not believe they are brave still become heroic? The answer comes through his actions. Throughout the mission, Grace repeatedly faces situations where fear would be the natural response. He is isolated millions of miles from home. He faces unknown technology, unfamiliar biology, and problems where failure means death. Yet he continues. Not because he is fearless. Because there is something more important than his fear. His evolution reaches its most powerful point when he chooses Rocky over his own return to Earth. By that moment, Grace has changed completely. The man who once struggled with the idea of sacrificing himself for humanity willingly gives up his chance to return home for the survival of another species. The decision proves that his journey was never just about becoming a better scientist. It was about becoming a better person. At the beginning, Grace views heroism as something belonging to other people, astronauts, soldiers, explorers, individuals who are naturally brave. He does not see himself as someone capable of extraordinary choices. But by the end, he discovers that heroism is not about being fearless. Fear is still present. Loss is still painful. The uncertainty is still overwhelming. The difference is that Grace learns to act despite those feelings. His final choice represents the complete transformation of his character. The reluctant teacher who never wanted to leave Earth becomes the person willing to leave Earth behind forever. And that contradiction is what makes Ryland Grace such a compelling protagonist. He does not save the universe because he was always destined to be a hero. He saves it because, when the moment arrives, he chooses to become one. Project Hail Mary presents an unusual challenge when analyzing its antagonistic forces because the story does not revolve around a traditional villain. There is no single enemy with a personal desire to destroy humanity, no evil mastermind creating chaos, and no opponent driven by hatred or revenge. Instead, the story's greatest obstacles come from two completely different forces. One is a force of nature. The other is a human response to fear. The first is astrophage. At first, astrophage appears to represent an almost impossible enemy. It threatens the survival of Earth, affects the sun's energy output, and places the future of humanity at risk. From the perspective of those experiencing the crisis, it is an existential threat unlike anything they have ever faced. But what makes astrophage fascinating is that it is not evil. It has no intention. No hatred. No desire to destroy. It is simply an organism following its natural instincts. This distinction changes the way the story approaches conflict. In many science fiction narratives, humanity faces an enemy that can be defeated through confrontation. There is a clear opponent to fight, a force that can be understood through emotion. Astrophage does not offer that possibility. It cannot be reasoned with. It cannot be intimidated. It cannot be blamed. It exists according to the rules of biology and physics, making it closer to a cosmic force than a traditional antagonist. The danger comes not from malicious intent, but from humanity's inability to understand something that operates beyond their previous knowledge. This makes astrophage a representation of one of science fiction's oldest fears. The universe is not designed around human needs. The cosmos is not cruel, but it is indifferent. Stars burn, planets change, and life forms evolve without considering whether humanity is prepared. Astrophage embodies that reality. It is not a villain seeking victory. It is a reminder that survival requires adaptation. However, the second major antagonistic force in the story is far more complicated because it is human. Eva Strat represents a different kind of threat, one created not by nature, but by necessity. As the person responsible for organizing humanity's response, Strat becomes one of the most morally complex figures in the story. She is not presented as someone seeking power for personal ambition. Her motivation is clear: prevent extinction. But the methods she uses raise difficult questions. Strat is given extraordinary authority because ordinary systems are too slow to handle an extraordinary crisis. Governments, laws, and institutions that normally protect individual rights become obstacles in a situation where delay could mean billions of deaths. Her solution is absolute control. She overrides decisions. She ignores restrictions. She takes ownership of choices that would normally belong to entire nations and organizations. From a purely practical perspective, her approach is understandable. If humanity has limited time before disaster, hesitation can become its own form of failure. But the story does not allow viewers to accept her actions without questioning the cost. Strat operates according to a strict utilitarian philosophy: the survival of humanity justifies almost any sacrifice. Individual freedom, personal choice, and ethical boundaries become secondary when compared to the greater objective. The uncomfortable question is whether saving humanity is enough to justify removing the humanity from the process. This is what makes Strat such a compelling character. She is not wrong about the danger. She is not wrong about the urgency. In fact, many of her decisions may have been necessary. But necessity does not automatically make something morally simple. She represents the dangerous side of pure logic without emotional consideration. She sees the world as a series of problems requiring solutions, and people become pieces within that larger equation. This creates a powerful contrast with Ryland Grace. Both characters are driven by survival. Both understand the seriousness of the crisis. Both are willing to make difficult choices. But they approach those choices from opposite directions. Strat believes survival requires sacrificing empathy. Grace discovers that empathy is what makes survival meaningful. Strat saves humanity by treating the situation like an equation. Every decision is calculated by potential outcomes. If one person must suffer for billions to survive, she accepts that consequence. Grace begins from a completely different place. He is not motivated by power, efficiency, or obligation. His decisions are shaped by relationships and understanding. His greatest achievement is not simply discovering a scientific solution, but recognizing the value of another intelligent life. This creates one of the story's most important thematic contrasts. Strat represents survival at any cost. Grace represents survival with compassion. Neither approach is completely simple. Without Strat's determination, humanity may never have had a chance. Without Grace's empathy, humanity's success might have come at the cost of losing something essential about itself. The story ultimately suggests that survival requires both intelligence and morality. Logic can identify the path forward, but empathy determines why that path matters. Astrophage challenges humanity from outside, forcing it to confront the unpredictability of the universe. Stretch challenges humanity from within, forcing it to confront the difficult choices people make when fear becomes overwhelming. And between these two forces stands Ryland Grace, proving that the greatest strength of intelligence is not merely finding a solution. It is remembering who that solution is meant to protect. Although Ryland Grace stands at the center of Project Hail Mary, the emotional power of his journey comes from the relationships surrounding him. The story understands that even the most isolated adventure is ultimately defined by connection. A mission across millions of miles of empty space becomes meaningful not because one person survives alone, but because of the people and beings who shape that survival. The most important relationship in the story is the unlikely friendship between Grace and Rocky. Rocky represents one of the most ambitious ideas in modern science fiction, an alien character who is truly alien, yet deeply relatable. His design challenges the familiar image of extraterrestrial life. He is not a human figure with unusual features or a creature designed only to appear mysterious. His biology, communication, and physical existence are fundamentally different from humanity. At first glance, Rocky could easily appear intimidating. His appearance is unfamiliar, his movements are unlike anything human, and his species developed under completely different environmental conditions. He represents the fear that often surrounds first contact, the uncertainty of encountering something that does not fit within human expectations. But that first impression quickly changes. Beneath the strange exterior is a personality defined by warmth, intelligence, humor, and kindness. Rocky is not introduced as a threat. He is introduced as someone trying to understand the same impossible situation as Grace. That contrast becomes one of the character's greatest strengths. The story takes something that audiences might normally associate with fear and transforms it into a source of friendship. Rocky proves that connection does not require familiarity. Two beings do not need the same appearance, language, or biology to recognize curiosity, trust, and compassion in each other. The development of their friendship is especially powerful because it begins with almost nothing in common. They cannot immediately speak. They cannot physically interact in normal ways. They do not even experience the universe through the same senses. Their relationship is built from patience. Every conversation requires effort. Every shared discovery requires compromise. They create a friendship one small understanding at a time. Humor becomes one of the most important tools in that process. Despite the enormous stakes surrounding them, Grace and Rocky develop a playful dynamic that gives the story emotional balance. Their interactions create moments of lightness inside a mission filled with danger and uncertainty. This humor is not just there for entertainment. It reveals trust. Being able to laugh with someone requires a level of comfort and acceptance. For two species separated by millions of miles of evolution, those moments represent something extraordinary. They are proof that emotional connection can exist even when communication seems impossible. Their friendship also develops through shared loss. Both characters carry the weight of what happened to their original crews and the civilizations depending on them. They are not simply scientists working together. They are survivors. That shared grief creates an emotional bond deeper than their scientific partnership. They understand each other not because they have identical experiences, but because they both know what it feels like to carry responsibility after losing others. The original Hail Mary crew members, Commander Yao and Olesya Ilyakina, remain important parts of Grace's psychological journey even after their deaths. Their presence represents the sacrifice behind the mission. They were not just crew members who failed to complete the journey. They were people who gave everything so that humanity could have a chance. Their deaths create a constant reminder that the mission's success comes with a human cost. Grace's memories of them add emotional weight to every decision he makes. He is not simply trying to complete a scientific objective. He is carrying the hopes and sacrifices of those who never returned. This contrasts with the Earth-based figures who helped create the Hail Mary mission. Individuals like Dimitri and the wider international scientific community represent the massive collective effort required to respond to the astrophage crisis. The mission is not the achievement of one person or one nation. It is the result of humanity mobilizing itself against a threat beyond individual borders. The story balances two different forms of teamwork. On Earth, cooperation is complicated by politics, urgency, and difficult moral decisions. Building the Hail Mary requires coordination on a global scale, with countless people contributing to humanity's survival. In deep space, cooperation becomes much more personal. It is no longer about organizations or governments. It is about two individuals learning how to trust each other. This contrast strengthens the central theme of the story. Large-scale survival depends on collective action, but meaningful connection happens between individuals. The supporting characters and relationships surrounding Grace show that Project Hail Mary is not truly a story about one man saving the world. It is a story about the networks of trust that allow impossible achievements to happen. The engineers, scientists, astronauts, and alien companion all contribute something essential. Each represents a different aspect of survival, sacrifice, intelligence, cooperation, and empathy. But Rocky's role remains the emotional centerpiece because he changes the meaning of the mission itself. Before meeting him, Grace believes he is traveling through space to save humanity. After meeting him, he understands that survival is much bigger than one species. The universe is not just a place to explore. It is a place where unexpected friendships can change everything. At its heart, Project Hail Mary is not simply a story about stopping a cosmic disaster. The astrophage crisis, the journey through space, and the search for a scientific solution all serve a larger purpose. Beneath the surface of its hard science fiction framework lies a story about what allows intelligent life to survive in the first place. The answer is not power. It is cooperation. One of the story's most important themes is scientific optimism, the belief that curiosity, knowledge, and persistence can help humanity overcome challenges that initially appear impossible. In many modern science fiction stories, advanced technology often becomes a source of danger. Scientific progress is portrayed as something that creates new problems faster than humanity can solve them. Project Hail Mary presents a different perspective. Science is not the enemy. Science is the bridge. The story treats discovery as one of humanity's greatest strengths. Problems are not solved through luck, destiny, or supernatural intervention. They are solved through observation, experimentation, failure, and determination. Every breakthrough comes from the willingness to ask questions and continue searching for answers. This approach reflects one of the most optimistic ideas in science fiction. The universe may be enormous and filled with dangers, but intelligence gives life the ability to adapt. The relationship between humanity and the Iridians expands this idea even further. Science becomes a universal language that exists beyond culture, appearance, and biology. Ryland Grace and Rocky come from completely different worlds, shaped by completely different evolutionary paths, yet they are able to understand each other through shared curiosity. They do not connect because they are similar. They connect because they both seek knowledge. Their partnership suggests that intelligence itself creates common ground. The laws of physics do not belong to one species. Mathematics, experimentation, and problem-solving are not human inventions alone. They are tools any advanced civilization might use to understand reality. In this way, Project Hail Mary transforms science from a collection of facts into a form of communication. Before Grace and Rocky can fully understand each other emotionally, they understand each other intellectually. Their discoveries become conversations. Their experiments become moments of cooperation. Each solved problem becomes proof that two completely different forms of life can work together. But the story goes beyond scientific collaboration. It explores radical empathy, the ability to care about another being even when there is no obvious personal benefit. This idea becomes most powerful in Grace's final choice. His original mission is to save Earth, and for much of the journey, that responsibility defines him. Humanity's survival is the objective that brought him into space. But his relationship with Rocky changes his understanding of what survival means. When Grace chooses to risk his own future to save Arid, he makes a decision that offers him no reward. There is no guarantee of recognition, comfort, or return. He chooses to help another civilization because it is the right thing to do. That choice represents one of the story's deepest messages. True morality is revealed when there is nothing to gain. Helping someone who can help you is cooperation. Helping someone when you may never benefit is compassion. Project Hail Mary suggests that this kind of empathy is not a weakness. It is a survival advantage. Civilizations that are capable of understanding and supporting others become stronger because they are no longer limited by their own knowledge. Humanity alone may have struggled to solve the astrophage problem. The Iridians alone may have faced the same challenge. But together, their combined intelligence creates possibilities neither could achieve independently. The story's greatest victory is therefore not the defeat of a microscopic organism. It is the discovery that cooperation itself can be a form of technology. The partnership between Grace and Rocky represents a hopeful vision of the future, one where encountering something unknown does not automatically lead to fear or conflict. Instead of asking whether humanity can dominate the universe, the story asks whether humanity can learn from it. This message feels especially meaningful in a genre often focused on isolation and destruction. Project Hail Mary does not deny the dangers of existence. The universe remains vast, unpredictable, and sometimes hostile. But it argues that intelligence does not survive by standing alone. It survives by reaching outward. Through science, empathy, and cooperation, two species facing extinction discover the same truth. The greatest achievement of intelligent life is not simply finding a way to live. It is finding a reason to live together. The visual language of Project Hail Mary is built around a series of contrasts. The story takes place across unimaginable distances and explores problems on a cosmic scale, yet its most powerful images often come from simple ideas: light and darkness, separation and connection, isolation and companionship. Every major visual element reinforces the emotional journey of Ryland Grace and the larger themes surrounding humanity's struggle for survival. One of the most striking symbols in the story is the Petrova line, stretching through the solar system. The mysterious phenomenon represents more than just a scientific anomaly. Visually, it becomes a scar across space, a sign that something is changing on a scale humanity cannot fully understand. It is beautiful and terrifying at the same time, a glowing reminder that the universe can contain both wonder and danger. The Petrova line transforms the vastness of space into something unsettling. The stars that once represented exploration and possibility now carry a warning. The same universe that inspires curiosity has become the source of humanity's greatest threat. This duality reflects one of the story's central ideas: discovery is never without risk. The unknown can bring knowledge, but it can also reveal how vulnerable life truly is. The contrast between light and darkness appears throughout the story. Light traditionally represents understanding, progress, and hope. Humanity's search for answers is literally a search for illumination, an attempt to understand a mystery hidden in the darkness. But darkness in Project Hail Mary is not simply empty space. It represents uncertainty. It represents isolation. It represents everything humanity does not yet know. The spacecraft itself becomes a physical representation of this conflict. The Hail Mary is surrounded by endless darkness, yet inside the ship exists the concentrated power of human intelligence. The small artificial environment becomes a fragile island of life moving through an enormous and indifferent universe. This creates a powerful visual contrast between the enormous scale of space and the limited space occupied by the characters. The universe is infinite. The spacecraft is not. Every hallway, laboratory, and living area reinforces the psychological pressure of isolation. The ship protects Grace from the dangers outside, but it also traps him inside a confined environment where every failure becomes more intense. The blip too creates another layer to this symbolism. When two spacecraft from different worlds meet, the visual contrast between them represents the differences between their civilizations. They are not designed for the same beings, they do not operate under identical conditions, and they were never meant to interact. Yet they find a way. The most important physical symbol of this connection is the xenonite barrier. At first, the transparent separation between Grace and Rocky represents everything dividing them. It is a reminder that they cannot simply enter each other's worlds. Their biology, environments, and survival requirements create a literal wall between them. The barrier reflects the emotional distance between two completely different forms of life. They can see each other, but they cannot truly reach each other. However, as their relationship develops, the meaning of that barrier changes. What begins as an obstacle becomes a bridge. The same structure that separates them also allows them to communicate safely and build trust. The barrier does not disappear. Its purpose changes. This becomes one of the story's most meaningful visual ideas. Connection does not require removing every difference between two beings. Sometimes understanding comes from creating a way to exist together despite those differences. Another fascinating contrast comes from the different ways Grace and Rocky experience the universe. Grace is a human scientist, and his understanding of the world is heavily visual. He observes, measures, and studies through sight. Images, diagrams, and physical evidence help him interpret reality. Rocky's perception is different. His communication and understanding rely heavily on sound and vibration. His world is experienced through frequencies and patterns that humans cannot naturally perceive. This creates a beautiful symbolic contrast between sight and sound. Light and vision represent one method of understanding. Music and vibration represent another. Neither is superior. They are simply different pathways toward knowledge. Their relationship proves that understanding does not require experiencing the universe in the same way. Two beings can interpret reality through completely different senses and still find common ground. The visual transformation of environments also reflects the emotional journey of the story. Earth-based laboratories are often associated with sterile, controlled spaces, bright surfaces, advanced technology, and the clinical atmosphere of human scientific achievement. Iridian environments, by contrast, represent a completely different relationship with the physical world. Their spaces are shaped by different biology and conditions, creating an atmosphere that feels unfamiliar yet strangely alive. The movement between these environments reinforces the story's central theme. Difference does not have to mean separation. By the end of the journey, the symbols that once represented isolation become symbols of connection. Darkness becomes the place where two civilizations find each other. A barrier becomes a pathway. An alien environment becomes a new home. Project Hail Mary's visual storytelling ultimately suggests that the universe may be vast enough to separate worlds, but curiosity and empathy are powerful enough to connect them. Beneath its scientific mysteries and interstellar adventure, Project Hail Mary is ultimately a story about identity, transformation, and what it means to become the person you were always capable of becoming. The journey of Ryland Grace is not only a physical mission across space. It is an internal journey where a man forced to confront his own fears slowly discovers a deeper understanding of responsibility, connection, and purpose. The most important symbol of this transformation is Grace's amnesia. At first, losing his memories appears to be a cruel punishment. He wakes up without knowing his name, his mission, or the events that brought him millions of miles away from Earth. He is separated from his own history, forced to exist without the identity he built over a lifetime. But this loss also creates an unexpected opportunity. Without his memories, Grace is temporarily free from the version of himself that existed before the mission. He cannot rely on his reputation, his excuses, or his previous understanding of who he is. He has to rebuild himself from the most basic foundation, his actions in the present. This makes his awakening almost like a psychological rebirth. The man who emerges inside the Hail Mary is not defined by his past mistakes or his fears. He is defined by what he chooses to do when faced with uncertainty. Every experiment, every discovery, and every decision becomes a piece of his reconstructed identity. In a strange way, his amnesia removes the ego that once limited him. Before the mission, Grace saw himself as someone who was not brave enough for extraordinary situations. He was a scientist and teacher, but not a hero. He believed courage belonged to other people, the people willing to step into danger without hesitation. But without his memories, he has no choice but to discover himself through action. He solves problems. He takes risks. He builds trust. Slowly, he realizes that courage was never about being fearless. It was about choosing to act even when fear remained. This transformation gives the story a deeper emotional meaning. Grace does not simply regain his memories. He becomes someone new. The threat of astrophage also carries symbolic meaning beyond the boundaries of science fiction. While the story focuses on a fictional cosmic crisis, the situation reflects real-world concerns about humanity's relationship with the environment and the consequences of ignoring large-scale problems. Astrophage functions as a metaphor for challenges that do not care about borders, politics, or individual interests. It affects the entire planet, forcing humanity to confront a reality where survival depends on cooperation rather than competition. In many ways, the crisis mirrors global environmental concerns. Problems such as climate change require collective action because their effects extend beyond any single country or community. No individual, organization, or nation can solve them alone. The response to astrophage reflects this reality. Humanity must combine knowledge, resources, and different perspectives to survive. The story does not suggest that science alone is enough. Discovery creates possibilities, but cooperation turns those possibilities into solutions. The mission succeeds because people are willing to share knowledge, accept different viewpoints, and work toward a common goal. This idea becomes even more powerful through Grace and Rocky's relationship. Their friendship represents the ultimate expansion of the story's message. Cooperation is not limited to different cultures or nations. It extends across completely different species. The universe does not become safer because humanity becomes stronger. It becomes safer because humanity learns that it does not have to stand alone. This is where Project Hail Mary separates itself from many darker science fiction stories. Instead of suggesting that survival depends on dominance, isolation, or technological superiority, it argues that survival depends on empathy. The final meaning of Grace's journey is revealed through his ultimate choice. He begins as someone who believes he is incapable of the sacrifices expected from heroes. He ends as someone willing to give up his own future for another civilization. The person who once feared losing his own life becomes someone willing to protect another form of life. That transformation reveals the story's deepest philosophical idea: survival is not the only goal. A civilization that survives without compassion has preserved only its existence, not its humanity. Project Hail Mary suggests that the greatest achievement of intelligent life is not simply overcoming extinction. It is maintaining the ability to care, connect, and cooperate even when the universe presents overwhelming challenges. The journey across space ultimately leads back to a very human truth. Knowledge helps us understand the universe. But empathy gives that understanding meaning. Bringing Project Hail Mary to the screen requires solving one of the most difficult challenges in modern science fiction: making invisible scientific concepts feel real. The story is built around ideas that cannot normally be seen: gravity, radiation, microscopic organisms, and biological processes occurring on a scale beyond human perception. The visual effects are not simply responsible for creating impressive images. They are responsible for making the audience believe in a world governed by scientific rules. One of the first challenges is representing life aboard the Hail Mary. Space travel is often simplified in films, with spacecraft behaving like airplanes moving through an atmosphere. But Project Hail Mary is built around the realities of physics. In space, every movement matters. Every acceleration creates consequences. Every change in direction affects the human body. The film's depiction of zero gravity requires careful attention to movement, because weightlessness changes the way people interact with their environment. Objects do not simply fall. Bodies do not move with normal balance. Even simple actions become different when there is no natural force pulling everything downward. The spacecraft itself becomes an important visual tool for showing these realities. The Hail Mary's design reflects the need to create artificial gravity through rotation, allowing the crew to function during the long journey. The transition between different gravitational environments becomes more than a technical detail. It affects how the characters experience their mission physically and psychologically. A person who is comfortable walking in one section of the spacecraft may suddenly struggle when entering another environment with different forces acting on their body. These details create a sense that space is not just a different location. It is a completely different physical reality. The challenge becomes even greater when portraying relativistic space travel. At these distances, the journey cannot simply be shown as a vehicle moving quickly from one point to another. The effects of acceleration, time, and distance must influence the visuals. The spacecraft should feel like a machine fighting against the enormous scale of the universe. The audience should feel the difficulty of crossing the gap between worlds. Perhaps the most ambitious visual challenge is bringing Rocky to life. Creating an alien character is easy when the goal is simply to make something unusual. The harder task is creating a creature that feels genuinely different while still allowing audiences to connect emotionally with it. Rocky cannot rely on human facial expressions, eye contact, or familiar body language. His biology is completely separate from ours. His physical structure, movement, and communication must reflect an entirely different evolutionary path. The design must avoid making him feel like a human character wearing an alien appearance. At the same time, the audience needs to understand his emotions. This requires a careful balance between alien realism and expressive animation. Rocky's personality cannot come from familiar human gestures, so his movements, sounds, timing, and reactions must communicate intelligence and warmth in different ways. Small details become important. The way he moves when excited. The way he reacts when solving a problem. The way his body language changes during emotional moments. These subtle choices allow audiences to recognize a personality beneath an unfamiliar exterior. Rocky's design also reinforces one of the story's biggest ideas: intelligence does not have one appearance. The visual effects must convince viewers that this creature evolved under completely different conditions, yet still possesses curiosity, humor, and emotional depth. Beyond character creation, the film also faces the challenge of visualizing scientific phenomena that normally exist beyond human observation. The Petrova line requires transforming an astronomical mystery into something visually understandable. It must appear enormous enough to represent a threat to entire worlds while still maintaining the scientific feeling of something that could exist within the universe. Astrophage creates another challenge because its impact comes from microscopic behavior. The film must show something too small to see naturally and make it feel important. Visual effects can transform invisible biological processes into images that communicate the scale and danger of the organism. Amoeba introduces an even more complex problem because it represents life fighting against life. Its behavior, growth, and interaction with astrophage must feel scientifically believable while still creating dramatic tension. These sequences require effects artists to work closely with scientific concepts. The goal is not just to create something visually impressive. It is to create something that feels like the logical result of the rules established by the story. The production also depends on the balance between practical filmmaking and digital effects. Spaceships, airlocks, laboratory environments, and mechanical systems benefit from physical construction because real environments give actors something tangible to interact with. A practical set allows performances to feel grounded. Actors can touch surfaces, react to physical objects, and move through spaces that exist beyond imagination. Digital effects then expand those environments, creating the scale and complexity that practical construction alone cannot achieve. The combination allows the film to feel both realistic and cinematic. This balance is especially important for a story centered on isolation. The Hail Mary cannot feel like an empty digital environment. It must feel like a place where a person has lived, worked, struggled, and survived. Ultimately, the visual effects of Project Hail Mary serve the same purpose as the science itself. They make the impossible understandable. From the movement of a spacecraft through space to the existence of an alien friend unlike anything humanity has seen, every visual decision supports the story's central idea. The universe is unfamiliar. But with enough curiosity, even the impossible can become something we understand. The challenge of directing Project Hail Mary is not simply creating a believable journey through space. The greater challenge is maintaining emotional engagement in a story where much of the conflict comes from thinking, experimenting, and solving problems rather than traditional action. This is where the directorial approach of Phil Lord and Christopher Miller becomes especially important. Their filmmaking style has often been defined by the ability to combine large-scale concepts with human emotion, humor, and unexpected warmth. Instead of treating science fiction as something distant or overly serious, their approach focuses on making extraordinary situations feel personal. Project Hail Mary requires that exact balance. The story contains massive scientific ideas, extinction-level stakes, and a journey across millions of miles. But beneath those elements is a simple emotional foundation. One person trying to understand the universe and find connection within it. Lord and Miller's challenge is making sure the audience never loses sight of that human element. One of their greatest strengths is understanding that humor does not weaken serious storytelling. In fact, humor can make dramatic moments more powerful by allowing audiences to connect with characters as real people rather than simply observing them as symbols. Ryland Grace is not introduced as a perfect hero. He is nervous, confused, and often overwhelmed by the situation around him. His humor comes from his humanity. He reacts to impossible circumstances in ways that feel recognizable, creating moments where audiences can relate to him even while watching an extraordinary adventure. This comedic rhythm becomes especially important during the scientific sequences. A story centered around experiments, calculations, and technical explanations carries the risk of becoming emotionally distant. If every scene focused only on information, the audience could understand the science without feeling invested in the person solving the problems. The direction must transform scientific discovery into drama. A failed experiment is not simply a failed experiment. It is a moment of tension. A new discovery is not simply new information. It is a moment of hope. The pacing of Project Hail Mary depends on this emotional interpretation of science. The audience needs to feel the pressure behind every calculation and understand why each breakthrough matters. This is particularly challenging because the story spends significant time with Grace alone. Traditional cinematic storytelling often relies on conversations between multiple characters to create energy. Here, much of the early journey depends on one person inside a spacecraft trying to solve problems through observation and reasoning. The direction must make solitude engaging. The camera becomes a crucial part of that process. Inside the Hail Mary, tighter framing emphasizes isolation. The spacecraft is not only a vehicle but a confined environment where every movement and decision feels amplified. Narrow spaces, controlled compositions, and carefully chosen angles can make the audience feel the pressure of being trapped millions of miles away from home. The ship becomes a psychological space as much as a physical one. In contrast, the external views of space provide a completely different visual language. Wide cosmic shots emphasize scale, reminding viewers how small the characters are compared to the universe surrounding them. This contrast creates one of the story's strongest visual tensions. Inside the spacecraft, Grace is surrounded by problems. Outside the spacecraft, he is surrounded by infinity. The direction constantly balances those two perspectives. Another major challenge comes from creating believable interaction between Grace and Rocky. Since Rocky's character requires extensive visual effects and digital creation, the filmmaking process must ensure that the relationship feels emotionally real during production. For an actor, performing opposite a character who may not physically exist on set requires imagination and precision. The performance cannot rely on normal human interaction. Timing, eye lines, reactions, and emotional responses must all be carefully coordinated. Practical references, performance aids, and interactive elements help create a stronger connection between actor and digital character. The goal is not for Grace to appear as though he is talking to an effect. The goal is for the audience to believe he is talking to a person. That distinction is essential. Because Rocky's importance does not come only from his appearance. It comes from the relationship he builds with Grace. If that emotional connection does not feel authentic, the entire heart of the story becomes weaker. Lord and Miller's directorial challenge is therefore about finding harmony between opposing elements. Science and emotion. Humor and danger. Isolation and connection. Small human moments and enormous cosmic events. A lesser approach could allow the scientific concepts to overpower the characters or allow the spectacle to overshadow the emotional journey. But the story succeeds when these elements work together. The universe feels massive because the characters feel small. The problems feel impossible because the solutions require creativity. The friendship feels meaningful because it develops between two beings who were never expected to understand each other. Through careful pacing, visual storytelling, and a balance between intellectual curiosity and emotional warmth, the direction transforms Project Hail Mary from a story about surviving space into a story about discovering what makes life worth saving. In Project Hail Mary, sound is not simply a background element designed to create atmosphere. It becomes another form of storytelling, a way to communicate emotions and ideas that words alone cannot fully express. The score plays a unique role because the story itself is built around communication, discovery, and the challenge of understanding something completely unfamiliar. The music becomes part of that journey. From the earliest moments of the mission, the score establishes the emotional contrast between humanity's fragile existence and the enormous scale of the universe surrounding it. Space is portrayed not only as a physical environment but as a psychological experience. It is beautiful, mysterious, and terrifying at the same time. The musical language surrounding the spacecraft reflects this uncertainty. Cold, atmospheric tones create a sense of distance and isolation. Electronic textures and carefully controlled sounds emphasize the mechanical nature of the Hail Mary and the artificial environment keeping grace alive. These sounds remind the audience that space is not a natural home for humans. It is a place where survival depends on technology. This creates a powerful contrast with the warmer musical elements that emerge as the story progresses. As Grace moves from isolation toward connection, the score gradually reflects that emotional transformation. The music begins to feel less mechanical and more alive, mirroring the way the mission changes from a solitary human effort into a partnership between two civilizations. One of the most fascinating musical challenges comes from Rocky's communication system. Unlike human speech, Iridian communication is based on musical patterns, tones, and chords. This means Rocky does not simply speak with a different language. He communicates through a completely different relationship with sound itself. The score has the opportunity to transform this concept into a central musical idea. Rocky's sounds can become more than dialogue. They can become emotional signatures. The patterns of his communication can represent curiosity, humor, concern, or excitement, allowing audiences to understand his personality even before they fully understand his meaning. This reflects one of the story's most important themes: communication does not always require similarity. Humans use words. The Iridians use musical structures. Yet both forms of expression carry emotion. The music therefore becomes a bridge between two species, just as science becomes a bridge between two worlds. The contrast between human and Iridian sound also reinforces the differences between their perspectives. Grace experiences the universe through visual observation and scientific measurement, while Rocky's world is deeply connected to vibration and frequency. The score can combine these two approaches, blending human musical traditions with unfamiliar patterns to create something that feels both recognizable and alien. Beyond the relationship between Grace and Rocky, the music also supports the larger threats driving the story. The astrophage crisis requires a different emotional tone. The organism itself is not evil, but its impact represents a growing danger. The music surrounding this threat can emphasize inevitability rather than aggression. Instead of creating the feeling of an enemy attacking, the score captures the fear of facing a natural process that humanity does not yet understand. This distinction is important. The danger comes from uncertainty. The fear comes from helplessness. The score also helps define the emotional presence of Earth and the people connected to the mission. Themes associated with the Hail Mary can represent sacrifice, determination, and the weight of carrying an entire planet's hopes into the unknown. The spacecraft is not simply a machine. It is a symbol of everything humanity has risked. Similarly, Eva Strat's influence on the story can be reflected through a more controlled and precise musical identity. Her character represents logic, urgency, and difficult decisions. A colder musical approach can reinforce the emotional distance she maintains while managing humanity's survival. Her theme does not necessarily represent evil. It represents necessity. The sound of the global crisis can also carry the weight of the environmental threat facing Earth. The idea of a coming ice age creates a sense of slow, unavoidable danger. Unlike traditional disasters that arrive suddenly, the astrophage crisis develops gradually, creating a feeling of time running out. The music must capture that pressure. A ticking clock hidden beneath the surface. A planet waiting for an answer. Ultimately, the score of Project Hail Mary functions as another form of scientific communication. Just as Grace and Rocky learn to understand each other through patterns and signals, the audience learns to understand the story through sound. The music does not simply tell viewers what to feel. It helps them experience the journey. It captures the loneliness of deep space, the fear of extinction, the excitement of discovery, and the warmth of an unexpected friendship. In a story where two beings from different worlds must find a way to communicate, the score becomes the first universal language they share. In a story about traveling through the emptiness of space, silence becomes one of the most important sounds. Project Hail Mary exists in an environment where traditional cinematic expectations must be reconsidered. Space is often portrayed as a place filled with dramatic explosions, roaring engines, and constant movement, but the reality of space is far quieter. There is no atmosphere to carry sound. No distant rumble. No natural echo. Only emptiness. The sound design of Project Hail Mary must respect this reality while still creating a cinematic experience. The challenge is not making space loud. It is making silence meaningful. Inside the Hail Mary, sound becomes a reminder of survival. The spacecraft is a carefully controlled artificial environment surrounded by a deadly vacuum. Every mechanical noise has purpose. The hum of equipment, the movement of systems, and the subtle vibrations of technology create the feeling that the ship is constantly working to keep its occupants alive. The spacecraft becomes a living machine. When everything functions correctly, the sounds are controlled and predictable. They represent stability. They create a sense of routine in an environment where nothing else feels normal. But when something goes wrong, those same sounds become warnings. A change in a familiar noise can create immediate tension because the audience understands that the ship's systems are not simply background details. They are the difference between life and death. This approach allows sound to become part of the storytelling rather than just an addition to the visuals. A malfunction does not always need to be shown immediately. Sometimes, the first sign of danger is what the audience hears. A change in pressure. An unusual mechanical vibration. A system operating differently than before. These subtle audio cues place viewers inside Grace's experience. Like him, they must interpret the environment and recognize that something has changed before the full danger becomes visible. This creates a more immersive form of suspense. The audience is not only watching a problem happen. They are discovering it alongside the character. The sound design becomes especially important during moments involving spacecraft failures and physical danger. A hull breach, equipment failure, or structural problem must communicate the seriousness of the situation without relying on unrealistic effects. Because Project Hail Mary is built around scientific authenticity, the audio must follow the same philosophy as the visuals. The sounds should feel like they come from the materials, machines, and environments established by the story. Inside the spacecraft, sound travels normally because there is air. Outside, there is only silence. This contrast can make exterior sequences even more powerful. The absence of sound reminds viewers that space is not an extension of Earth. It is an environment where humanity exists only through technology and preparation. The most advanced machines in existence are still surrounded by absolute quiet. The astrophage-powered spin drive presents another major sound design challenge. The technology represents one of the most important achievements in the story, allowing humanity to travel across enormous distances. Its sound must communicate both scientific innovation and physical power. A traditional spaceship engine sound would not be enough. The spin drive is not a conventional rocket. It represents a completely different approach to movement through space, so its audio identity must feel unfamiliar while still believable. The design needs to suggest controlled energy, immense power, and advanced engineering. Rather than simply creating noise, the sound should communicate function. The audience should feel that something extraordinary is happening even when they do not fully understand the technology behind it. This is one of the strengths of effective science fiction sound design. It makes fictional technology feel real by giving it a consistent identity. The same principle applies to astrophage itself. Because the organism operates on a microscopic level, sound becomes an important tool for giving it presence. The audio can suggest activity, energy exchange, and transformation without pretending that a tiny biological process would naturally create dramatic sounds. The goal is emotional interpretation, not scientific exaggeration. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of the sound design is how it reflects the story's central themes of isolation and connection. At the beginning of the mission, Grace's world is defined by mechanical sounds and empty silence. The spacecraft is filled with technology but missing another human presence. Later, the soundscape changes as Rocky enters his life. Communication becomes musical. Silence becomes conversation. The empty spacecraft becomes a place where two different forms of intelligence learn to understand each other. Sound becomes the bridge between worlds. In many ways, Project Hail Mary's audio design follows the same journey as its characters. It begins with separation and uncertainty, using silence to emphasize the loneliness of space. But as the story develops, those sounds become evidence of connection, discovery, and cooperation. The universe may be silent, but intelligent life has always found ways to create a signal. When Project Hail Mary entered the public conversation, one of the most surprising aspects of its reception was how strongly audiences connected with something that could have easily felt inaccessible. A story built around astrophysics, alien biology, and complex scientific problems might have seemed like a difficult sell for mainstream audiences. Instead, it became an example of how curiosity and intelligence could become major sources of entertainment. The response to the story was shaped by the same elements that made the narrative unique: its optimism, its scientific imagination, and most importantly, its unexpected emotional center. Rocky quickly became the defining element of audience discussion. For many viewers and readers, the introduction of an alien character was where the story transformed from an impressive science fiction concept into something unforgettable. Science fiction has a long history of portraying extraterrestrial life as a threat, a mystery, or a reflection of humanity's own fears. Alien encounters often lead to invasion, conflict, or questions about whether different species can coexist. Project Hail Mary offered something dramatically different. Rocky was not a monster waiting to be defeated. He was not an enemy hiding a dangerous agenda. He was a friend waiting to be understood. That reversal became one of the story's biggest emotional successes. Audiences responded to the idea that first contact could be based on cooperation rather than fear. The appeal of Rocky came from the contrast between his unfamiliar appearance and his deeply recognizable personality. He looked completely alien, yet his curiosity, humor, and loyalty made him immediately relatable. The phrase associated with Rocky's excitement and discovery became a symbol of the character's unique charm. Moments surrounding his communication style, including the repeated expression of amazement and enthusiasm, spread widely among fans because they captured the emotional simplicity at the heart of the story. Rocky represented the joy of discovery itself. He reminded audiences why science fiction has always been connected to wonder. Online communities embraced the character through discussions, artwork, theories, and creative interpretations. Fans connected not only with Rocky as an individual character, but with what he represented, the possibility that the unknown does not have to be frightening. The reaction also reflected a larger cultural desire for a different type of science fiction. For years, many major science fiction stories focused on collapse, dystopia, and humanity's darkest possibilities. These stories explored important fears about technology, society, and the future, but they often presented tomorrow as something defined by conflict. Project Hail Mary arrived with a more hopeful perspective. It did not ignore danger,